Hello everyone, welcome to my channel about writing stuff. My name's Camille and today we're talking about world building. Since this is a pretty heavy topic, I'll try not to ramble or get lost somewhere off in tangent land. And since there's a lot to cover, today I'm just going to cover the big stuff, where to start, what kind of questions to ask, and then over the next couple of weeks I'll dig into languages, cultures, and magic systems. All right, so you want to build a full secondary world. Where do you start? For me, it's, going back to my first video about trying to write at least one full book a year. It's really hard to start right from scratch. So what I like to do is find a baseline. So whenever I'm thinking about starting to build my world, I do a little bit of research and I pick a specific era and time in the hopes of looking for three specific things. That is the technology, medicine, and what transportation looks like. And what I love about this idea is that if you know what kind of technology that you're going to have in your world, if you know what kind of medicine you're going to have in your world, and what transportation looks like, then you can go back and reference that time period later on to, find out what people used for light, how people cooked their food, how crops were harvested, and things like that. Literally so that you don't have to build your whole world entirely from scratch. For example, the first book that I wrote, I knew that I wanted people to be able to travel by train, but I didn't want cars yet in that world. So I went roughly with like an 1800s and era, and that really informed, that's what my baseline was, is 1800s Europe, roughly. Another example is in the book that I'm writing now, I knew that I really wanted to have explosive type of weaponry in my world, but I didn't want guns. So I went with 1100s China because they had invented gunpowder, also known as black powder, roughly 2 centuries before guns started showing up in Europe. So once I have my baseline, what I like to do is introduce my first big idea. And it's usually a magic system, or, it can be anything from wanting to have a world with dragons or unicorns, wanting to have fairies in your world, to wanting to have a dark overlord, whatever it is, whatever your big idea is. And then what I do is I extrapolate that through my baseline era. So let's say that your big idea for your world is you want to have these magic crystals that lets the holder change the weather. And let's say you're extrapolating that through a typical medieval Europe. So the first two big questions that you want to ask yourself, this is a tip from Mary Robinette Kowal, is you ask, how does this affect the richest members of society and the poorest members of society? So if you're in a world where you have these magic crystals that lets the holder change the weather patterns, then in a medieval type of Europe, the richest people in that society would probably be the ones using these things. They would be using them in warfare to send, storms and blizzards to defeat enemy armies, to come down on their crops and destroy their agriculture. They would be the ones that could afford to buy and sell and trade these sorts of things, whereas the poorest members of society would be the ones suffering, struggling to survive from the inclement weather. They would probably suffer from things like food shortages. They would probably be hiding in really terrible shelter, or, trying to steal these crystals so that they could get a leg up in the world, you know, things like that. And when you extrapolate this big idea through your baseline historical era, what you're doing is essentially just asking questions. You know, how does this change government and politics? How does this change flora and fauna? How does this change trade? Does this sort of thing create jobs? How does this affect, you know, like dating life or how people cook food? All these sorts of things. And at this point, you're really just brainstorming, just jotting down these one-line things about, you know, how things change, how are things different with this big intro idea. And then, so once I have all of those big picture things sort of mapped out, what I like to do is make my world my own. You know, I love using Tolkien as an example because, you know, he really created the best secondary world anyone had ever seen. And, you know, one could argue that his world was so much in depth and so great because he spent, you know, 20, 30 years creating it. But, you know, the reason why it was so good, in my opinion, is because Tolkien loved things like folklore and, you know, building these fantastic cultures and races and languages and having dragons and doing all these really great things. And that's something anyone can do. You know, if you are a geek for food, if you're a foodie, you could build a really in-depth food culture, really dig into it, show the different types of foods in the different regions, and you can have your characters experiencing these new things. And, you know, that's what's great about world building too, is if you do it well, it will inform your character and it will help inform your plot, and vice versa. So let's say you love music or art. You can build a really great art culture in your world where, you know, it's commonplace to trade a song for a loaf of bread. Let's say you love to knit or crochet like I do. You could create a really in-depth cohesive magic system where a different stitch or a different pattern, you know, can give you an hour's worth of different telekinetic power. And then that can inform a religion in your world where, you know, all the grandmothers are worshipped and bowed down to because they're all really good at knitting. And, you know, that may sound kind of silly, but if you had a magic system like that, then things like knitting patterns would be sold on the black market. You know, people would be making knitting needles out of bone or wood or whatever they could because, you know, all the regular knitting needles would be confiscated by the government. And, you know, that's really the kind of things you want to dig into is what do you know, what do you love? And people always say that. People say, write what you know, but I'm a firm believer in the write what you love. Because if you love folklore and philosophy, then those are brilliant things to build in your world, and you can breathe a different sort of life into those things. You can go really far in depth and have fun while you're doing it, and that will add a realism and a cohesion to your world that you wouldn't find in someone else's writing. Another thing that I like to do when I'm brainstorming these big ideas is to look for and make a special note of those sources of conflict. Going back to the example that I used earlier of the magic crystals that can change the weather patterns, you know, there would be a black market for something like that in your world. And with things like illegal trade and illegal sales comes a lot of danger, a lot of conflict, outside tension. So later, when I start putting characters into this world, I would probably put a character right in the center of that conflict, because it would make him a lot more interesting to read about, him or her. And there'd be a lot of, outside tension, influence, and a lot of room to add in some of those subplots. And some of you out there in internet land might be saying, well, that's great, Camille. You're giving me these tips for building this, crazy secondary world, but I want to write a YA contemporary story that mostly takes place in a high school. Well, you can apply these same sorts of ideas to a contemporary setting. You want your main setting to be a high school. Well, start asking the questions of what makes this school different. Is it indoor-outdoor? Is it small out in the country? Is it big in a major city? What is the hierarchy? What does the social structure look like? Are there certain electives? And this sort of world building, really can inform your character. Let's say there is a drama elective in this high school that's being defunded, but you have a character that really loves it. So that could be a source of conflict for that character, or be a side plot or a subplot for that character. Let's say there's a lot of social tension and social strife between the cheerleaders and the drama students, but you have a character that's both. That would cause a lot of relational issues for that character. But these are the big ideas. It's, for me, I start with a baseline, I introduce my big ideas, and I ask a lot of questions. Everything from, how does this change dating life, to how does this affect global politics? And while I'm doing this, I also try and keep in mind, what do I love? How can I put my own voice and my own interests into this world? So, like I said at the beginning of the video, over the next couple of weeks, I'll really dig into this. I'll go over cultures, languages, magic systems, and possibly dig into some of the little things like flora and fauna. But my resource for this week is a big one of my favorites. It's Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. And what I love about this podcast is it's not your typical history lesson. What Dan Carlin does is he does so much research, and he knows his stuff so well that he creates these, 2 to 4 hour long, really in-depth, meaty episodes. And he gives sort of a narrative sense to these history stories, but what's really great is he does an excellent job of painting a really beautiful picture. So, if you're starting your world building and you're kind of struggling with, your baseline, what you want your core technology and medicine and travel to look like, definitely recommend listening to a few episodes, and, hopefully you'll be inspired that way. So that's Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. And that's all I got for you this week. So I'll see you guys next time. And for now, you should be writing stuff.